Good evening from beautiful Paris. I'm really delighted to welcome you all for the first Women's Forum Daring Circle virtual session. As you know, our Daring Circle are innovative cross-industry working groups guiding Women's Forum partners both in the public and in the private sectors, academics, experts, NGOs, scientists. We work not only on gender issues, but on critical, crucial issues that concerns the entire humanity. Therefore, we work on women for AI, women for business, women for climate actions, women for health, women for STEM. Key issues where women are disproportionately impacted and where the leadership is paramount. I'm very proud for what we have been achieving in the Daring Circle since 3 years. Thank you all for your commitment, your insights, your action, your initiatives. Now it is a time to act and concretize this work. The pandemic has made some of the obstacles to women more visible, but the pandemic demonstrates the essential role women are playing in economies in society. Women are on the front line to take care of the most vulnerable population, but women are also the driving force behind progress in innovation, science, research, policies to fight the pandemics. You know, 91% of the G7 population considers gender equality a priority, according to our Women's Forum barometer. A priority. What are we waiting for? There is a momentum. There is a momentum for she-covery, where women are fully involved with men in shaping a better future for all. Now more than ever, we need women's voices, ambition and action to co-create a more sustainable future. Now more than ever, we need women in the workforce, in the labs, in the boardrooms, at the decision-making tables to lead climate action, to design the future of work, to drive ethical and responsible finance. Now, more than ever, we need a change of paradigm, with women at the heart of the economy, science, and society. This year, we stand ready to lead with power and purpose. Women bringing their added value and their strong contribution across generations, cultures, regions, private and public sectors. We will launch our call to action to G7 and G20 leaders. We will take our flagship meetings and bring the Daring Circle works all around the world. We will spark collective action for inclusive progress. Let's engage for impact, for a she-covery for all.
Hello everyone. My name is Sophie Lambin and I'm the editorial partner for the Women's Forum. Over the past decades, artificial intelligence has become deeply embedded in the technologies and services around us, from search engines to hiring talent to insurance coverage. But today we are at a crossroads for AI. We can continue to refer to AI as technologies that repeat the bias and mistakes of the past, or we can consciously and intentionally harness it to facilitate more inclusive economies and societies. Which will we choose? And what kind of leadership do we need to guide us towards inclusive AI? In this session today, we will be exploring what is the next for the future of AI. Yes, we need it to be designed and implemented responsibly and without bias. But that's just the start. To realize its full potential, we also need AI to be part of the solution, to address issues such as climate change, or inequality, or health access. To explore those questions, I am here with 5 outstanding women, all leading in AI. We are going to kick off with a short video which lays out the work of the Women's for AI Daring Circle from Shelley McKinley, Vice President of Technology and Corporate Responsibility at Microsoft.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shelley McKinley. I'm the Vice President for Technology and Corporate Responsibility at Microsoft. We are a proud global strategic partner of the Women's Forum, and we're also the lead partner for the work of the Women in AI Daring Circle. So it's my real pleasure to be here today to be able to offer a few comments in advance of our next session. 1 year ago, my colleague Marisa Hugh-Weller stood on stage at the Women's Forum to announce the formation of the AI Daring Circle. As Marisa outlined last year, it's so important that all organizations develop and deploy artificial intelligence in a way that not only ensures that it's free of gender bias, which is really important, but that AI is used as a tool to empower women, envisioning that future where our daughters, who are the scientists and CEOs and world leaders, can use powerful technology like AI to create a more just and a more equitable future. This work started last year with the AI Daring Circle's call to action, challenging companies to apply a gender lens to their AI development and to their implementation, and to pledge their commitment to inclusive AI. So much has happened in the last 12 months since November of last year, and the world is in a different place. We're battling a global pandemic and rising jobless numbers, and we know that these challenges disproportionately impact women, minority populations, and others who are already struggling to not be left behind. And we know we've made progress since last year on our commitments to inclusive AI, but we also know that we have a long way to go, and advancing beyond that call to action we made 1 year ago is more important than ever. I'm an optimist, and while there is a tough road ahead of us all in this pandemic, I know that the planet will recover. But we need to ensure that we foster not just an economic recovery, but an inclusive recovery where everyone, everywhere, has the chance to participate in the societal and economic opportunities of the 21st century. And that's what I find so inspiring about the work of the Women's Forum. Yes, we are focused on key issues where women are disproportionately impacted, but we are equally focused on the role and the opportunity that women have to lead outsized positive change for all. And it's this outsized opportunity that makes me really excited about the discussion that we're going to have on the next panel, where we'll talk about how artificial intelligence can be harnessed to redress injustice and to create a better world for humanity. With that, thank you very much, and now I will turn it over to the panel.
Thank you, Shelley. The scene is set. And Gina, I'm now going to hand over to you. Gina Neff is Professor of Technology and Society at the University of Oxford, and she will be moderating a panel. Gina, over to you.
Thank you, Sophie, Shelley, Chiara, and thank you all for joining us today, wherever in the world you may be. I have a very large task set out for us. In some ways, I think we have with us today the most daring of the Daring Circle activities, which is how do we take a really thorny social problem and imagine a better future with it. As we know, this challenge of creating inclusive and sustainable AI systems, the technologies and data that will drive our future, the problem of creating unbiased AI is vast. We on the AI Daring Circle at the Women's Forum have spent the last 18 months really thinking about how we can challenge our organizations and others to build a more inclusive future for women and humanity in the systems that are being built. Today, what we want to do on this panel is push our thinking forward. Really think, if we get there, if we can build systems free of bias that are working for the betterment of humanity, working for the betterment of the planet, what kind of future could we have? And so joining me today is an incredible panel of experts. We'll start by having short one-on-one conversations with each of them and then bring us together for a panel. I have with us Gabriela Rasmus, who is joining us straight from the council meeting of UNESCO. I have, as she will be followed by Bonnie Lay from Microsoft and Rim Terawi from PNB Paribas. And joining us a little later will be Rahaf Harfouch from the consultancy Red Thread. So let's start with Gabriela. Gabriela, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gina. As you said, I'm so glad to be with you. I had a very interesting session on my board, but now is the time for this daring circle. So I'm very glad to be here with you and with Chiara and with the Women's Forum.
Thank you. You've done such amazing work at UNESCO in advocating for how AI should be better deployed for helping more places in the world and helping women. What do you want to bring forward to our conversation today on what kind of future we might be building when we can build better AI?
The baseline is not that good. Where we want to go is what matters. I think that what we have today, Gina, is that the digital world is just reproducing massively the gender gaps that we see in the analog world. Mm-hmm. And that's why at UNESCO, I'm leading the charts, and of course, members will negotiate it, but a global standard on ethics of artificial intelligence. And it's about the whole business model that is highly concentrated in certain firms producing the largest share of patents, 200 firms globally producing 77% of the patents. Is about certain countries, certain cultures, and therefore UNESCO being a global institution, our ethics for artificial intelligence, what we're trying to do is that the whole technological progress, which is amazing, and we have seen how much it had helped even to create the vaccine or to track the virus in the pandemic that we are facing now. But the reality is that this highly concentrated is not diverse, is not bringing voices that are different. And that's why you are seeing all these echo chambers being reproduced, the biases finding their way through the algorithms, the lack of transparency and how the technologies are taking decisions for us, because this is what exactly artificial intelligence do. They help you to simplify a vast amount of information to take decisions, but we need to know how they do that. So the ethics that of artificial intelligence that we are advancing, of course, it has to do with accountability, with diversity, with inclusiveness, but it has to be with women. Because if we were complaining that women were not represented in engineering or in STEM or in these disciplines that were usually for boys, in the AI is even less. And only 14% of the papers that are being produced in the general conferences for artificial intelligence are developed by women, and only 15% also of the developments of the software are done by women. Actually, a report I wrote in 2019 put the number at 85% of the developments are done by male-only teams. And then a report that UNESCO did, on that name is "I Blush If I Could." They said that's no surprise why all the assistants in the technological services are female voices. So we are just reproducing the biases. So what do we say? We say it's yes, there is something to be done by the industry, diversity, women at the table, as we do with all the industries, no longer male-only teams. Girls and quotas and affirmative action, that's a must. But then you need to continue pushing for the equality agenda around other sectors. Education sector, do not stereotype girls from the very beginning. Don't put them in a corner where they are less ambitious or where they don't see themselves fitting in industry or in technology or in engineering. Do not let women have 4 hours, 5 hours, 7 hours a day of family chores, because of course that unbalance the whole thing, and then they cannot invest in their careers. And then you have all of these elements, but more than anything, fight the stereotypes that artificial intelligence is just reproducing massively. I think this is very important, and I know that the members of UNESCO that are negotiating this instrument are supporting this, because we have a very strong gender chapter along with many other chapters.
This is a really good point to launch us off on, and I want to take up the challenge, if I may, that Chiara said out at the beginning of the session, where she said, to really imagine a future with women at the heart of the future of work. My question for you, Gabriela, is I imagine that we could think about women around the world in a very different way if we build AI in a more inclusive and sustainable way. How might we use AI to help women in the global South? How might we be thinking about improving sustainable development goals with AI? Are there things that you've been working on in that regard?
Well, let me tell you that one of the lessons that we learned, because when building this instrument, we of course went global and we did consultations. I don't think that we need to be thinking what kind of solutions do we provide for women on the South. No, we should be saying, how do we equip women of the South to define what do they want to get out of these technologies? Because I think that's the real question. How do we ensure that the education systems will provide with the skills, or the labor market will provide with the skills to deal with the technologies? But then for women to be the ones deciding what is the problem, the human problem that they want to solve, to then shape the technologies in a way that is suited for their own purposes. Because what happens now is that the technology is so exciting and so impressive, and so that we are very technologically driven. But this is about humans. We humans ask the machines what to do. We humans need to ensure that the data sets where they base their analytics for producing the decision-making outcomes, projections, etc., are completely inclusive, are diverse, are bulletproof. We need to ensure that whomever is developing the algorithm can explain. And I know that if you go to the black box, it's very difficult that you explain anything. But at the end, the one that takes the decisions and use what the technology is providing us is us. And so we need to invest in women engaging with the technologies and co-creating. Co-creating is not about I am a user and I will be enabled to use it or to consume it, because that's fine. And I'm sure that we all need to expand the infrastructure, and there are many things that we need to fill in terms of the gaps in the developing countries.
Yes.
But at the end is equipping the girls.
I think that's a great point to leave this section on, that we can empower women to define the problems as they see them. Thank you, Gabriela, and we'll see you in the larger panel. I'd like to bring on now Bonnie Lay from Microsoft to join us to talk about her work in environmental sustainability and AI.
Hi there, Gina. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you today.
Likewise. So I've been really impressed with how you've been talking about how AI can be used and must be used if we're talking about building a sustainable future. Can you share a little bit about what you've been working on?
Absolutely. I've been working on a program called AI for Earth at Microsoft, and this is a program that's centered on thinking through how can we make sure we're applying the latest innovations, the latest technologies in the AI and machine learning space, and make sure that they're applied to, not just to the problems that can make you a lot of money or the most promising, but make sure that they're being applied to tackling the biggest challenge that we're facing as a globe today, looking at climate change and looking at deep environmental issues. And so as part of the program, I think one of the things that it's really exciting to work on is to think through how it is that these technologies that have the capacity to take in big data, to allow for big compute, to allow for automations and lots of the time-consuming steps, actually really gives us an opportunity to catch up to these environmental issues that feel like they're exponentially growing, that feel like they're so difficult to tackle. And being able to leverage technology in the right way is going to give us an opportunity to really look at how we could catch up. But I think I really agree with what Gabriela just said, which is this idea that the technology, like that's a tool. That's something, there's that raw compute power associated with it. There's the algorithms you could apply. But what really needs to be considered is, how do we apply it? How do we make sure that we're directing this technology to tackle the right problems? How do we make sure that we're doing this in a way so that we're not just looking at how we could help some of the developed countries thrive, but really look at environmental justice across borders, across communities? Because when you're tackling a problem like environmental challenges and climate change, this is something that is happening without concern to human-drawn boundaries. This is something that crosses borders and really requires being able to collaborate broadly. And so I think that's one of the issues that, even as a program that's focused mainly on sustainability, we think through a lot of these issues around inclusivity across how it is that we're making sure that we're incorporating the viewpoints of women as well as men and all gender identities across the different identifications of socioeconomic status, et cetera, to really make sure that, again, we're not designing a sustainable world for the few, but a truly sustainable and inclusive and just world for all.
So you've laid out, I think, a great baseline for work that uses technology to build on a vision for how we might take on and tackle some of the biggest problems. What's the minimum for you in terms of that kind of engagement? What needs to be in place?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, Gina. It feels sometimes like such a huge, gargantuan problem, and really, it's like, like, how do we make sure we break it down into pieces that are achievable? And I think that's one of the pieces that's been really inspiring to get to work on, because, again, working in sustainability can feel really stressful and depressing because you're facing these big issues and challenges. But one of the things that I've really enjoyed is we've worked on a grants program through AI for Earth. We've been able to support more than 750 grantees working in more than 100 countries around the world. And each one of these grantees is working on a specific project, oftentimes local in their areas, that they've worked on being able to define the problem. And we have training and education programs tied together to allow them to look at how to deploy the technology in the best way to solve the issues that they've identified. I'll talk about just two of the example projects that I think are really good examples of how you think through putting a bit of technology as a tool to attack an issue. And these are both two projects that are personally quite hit home for me. One example is looking at how we work on illegal unreported fishing worldwide. My grandmother grew up in Myanmar in a small fishing community on the coastline, and her entire family, their entire sustenance was completely based off of small scale fishing. And that's actually, my background is not in technology. I actually worked for many years as a conservation biologist before joining Microsoft. And in that time was working on how it is that we could better understand the intersections of illegal fishing practices, as well as the community development needs, oftentimes sustenance-based, oftentimes based on their economic needs to be able to support their families. And so one of the really exciting things is working with this organization called Ocean Mind, who was able to use this complex system, multiple data sources streaming in, to be able to track vessels moving all across the globe, using satellite imagery, radar, tracking, and be able to actually predict, based off of how that vessel is moving in time and space, whether or not they're actually engaging in activity that's going to be certified and regular, or whether they're doing something that's suspicious. And in being able to work really closely with local communities, they were able to improve their algorithms over time and work on how to actually identify and find vessels that not only were doing unsustainable catches of endangered or stock that's in low count, but also intervene in cases of human slavery, where on those ships and on those boats, they were capturing people and forcing them to work. And so again, that was an example that hit particularly close to home, and made me realize again how important it is to make sure you're not just designing a system, but bringing in those users and stakeholders to help you to continue to improve on your system. Another example that also is really important to me is in California, where I actually grew up and spent the first years of my life. And in the Central Valley, you have lots of farm workers, migrant workers, who really are forming the backbone and the foundation of being able to feed much of the country and even the world, with California as its agricultural center. But with the huge amounts of droughts and unstable water supply, it's becoming harder and harder to not only get enough water for agriculture, but also enough water to help sustain these workers who are living in the area. And the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, a local nonprofit based in those communities, led by women, worked on creating this AI algorithm that's able to predict which of the wells that these families and communities are using are most at risk for drying up and well failure, and being able to look at how it is that interventions could be targeted to help protect these communities and make sure that they still have access to water supply. And so I think across both of these examples is really looking at how we make sure that, exactly like Gabriella said, women are at the heart of making and actually designing the solutions and identifying the problems. And I think the other piece is, sometimes you often hear in AI the idea that it's important to design with humans in the loop. And so it's very much not just the case of, like technology as the end all be all. You want to make sure that the technology and the AI piece is complemented by human ingenuity and improvements. And so this is a case where I think it's not important just to make sure humans remain in the loop as you're designing AI and improving AI, but specifically that women are core and in the loop.
That's great. Bonnie, you give us such a great place to leave this section on, where we think about it's not just women are part of the solution. Women have to be centrally involved, and a wide variety and diverse communities of people need to be centrally involved in asking the questions that we use AI technologies to solve. So thank you. And I'm looking forward to how we're going to bring these threads together during our panel discussion. Thank you, Bonnie. Next, I'd like to bring to the table Rim Terawi. She is the Group Chief Data Officer and Global Risks ESG Executive at BNP Paribas. Welcome, Rim.
Hi.
So Rim, I've been really impressed. We were a part of this debate earlier this year through the Women's Forum of, is technology bad, always bad? Is technology always good? I have been so impressed in our conversations and our work through the Daring Circle about how you think about and frame these questions around diversity and around the importance of getting the data right. And particularly in your role of having to do that in a really high stakes environment and of financial information. Tell us a little bit about what you've been thinking about and how you are looking at this kind of problem.
Hi, Gina, and I'm really delighted to participate to this super daring cycle, as you mentioned. I will start perhaps by offering a few perspectives about bias in AI models, because this is really keeping us very busy for now. And as mentioned by Gabriella and Bonnie, it's really, to some extent, at the heart of some of the issues we are facing today. And I think it's really important to well understand why we observe AI models displaying bias in their outputs. So sometimes this can be simply linked to the way training data has been selected. For instance, focusing exclusively on certain racial background or gender, in which case it's relatively easy to correct. And by the way, and as Gabriela has put it very clearly, it starts by infusing more diversity in the AI teams themselves. But there are many cases where it is not so much a problem of bias in the selection of the training data, but rather the problem of bias in the society, which is simply captured by the model training process. So said in other terms, as I keep saying to people in my teams, algorithms are only as good as the data on which they are trained. And we know that humans are hardwired for bias. Sometimes they are conscious, sometimes they are unconscious, but at the end, those cognitive biases are deeply rooted into virtually all the aspects of our economic and social environment, the workplace, the healthcare, the scholarship. So it's not really a surprise that they also infiltrate all this data that our society is producing. And as a consequence, the algorithms that are trained on this data. And actually, it's even worse than that, because the more we are using AI and incorporating it into our decision-making process, the more it can contribute to propagating, if not amplifying, our implicit and social cognitive biases.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that's part of what the work that you've been doing as part of the Daring Circle is really help push all of us to think through how can we make sure that we're building systems that don't amplify those biases. If we look forward to where we could go from sustainable development goals to kinds of risks that people face, what could a more inclusive future bring us? What could a more inclusive and sustainable set of AI technologies do for us?
Well, I think we can actually ask ourselves whether we should not doing it the other way around and being perhaps much more deliberate and proactive in using AI to nudge in the right direction. So inverting to some extent this bias issue. But perhaps before venturing into those uncharted water, but happy to discuss this further, there are some straightforward or more straightforward things we can do with AI to foster inclusion and sustainability. For instance, AI is a powerful tool to do profiling for instance, targeted marketing or customization of products and services. And actually, it can be as powerful to deliver personalized healthcare and education. AI can also facilitate in a very operational way the access to basic services. I'm thinking, for instance, about a collection of think tanks and UN bank agencies that has formed last year a sort of coalition to create a platform that relies on both AI and human expertise to guide COVID-19 decision making. So what the platform is doing in practice is, first of all, to track and trace the contagion chains via mobility data and AI, to identify and address the inaccurate information on COVID-19. And we know how this is important when it comes to medicine and vaccine. And very importantly, too, to find marginalized areas that are most affected by the second and the third order pandemic impacts, and then provide them with targeted support. Another example is how AI can help us build bridges between theory and practice when it comes to tracing and monitoring the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. We know that government and business leaders are making pledges all over the world to deliver those goals, but in practice, it's not easy to track the execution and the delivery. And here again, there are some very concrete and interesting initiatives that contribute to that. For instance, there is this project that has been launched by the Shooter Society to fight modern slavery by using AI to analyze and challenge the statement produced by businesses under the Modern Slavery Acts. So then the question is, do we need to go further and use those outputs to introduce nudge policies? For instance, if I take this example, this would mean providing individuals with the outcome of the modern slavery analysis in direct relationship with the products and the services that they are consuming, so they can integrate this information in their choice as an individual. That would be an interesting thing to explore.
That's really interesting. I hope we can pick this up too in terms of these big ideas we want to bring in the panel session. Rim, thank you so much, and I'll see you in just a few minutes at the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Rahaf Harfoush, who is the Executive Director of the Red Thread Institute of Digital Culture and also a member of the Daring Circle. Welcome, Rahaf. Oh, we might be muted. This wouldn't be 2021 if somebody didn't say that.
My bad, my bad. Hi, I'm unmuted now. I fixed it.
How are you doing?
I'm great. So good to see you.
It's really good to see you. Thank you for joining us. You know, you have an interesting anthropological lens on digital culture broadly defined. And, you know, we've been thinking through in these conversations today, kind of stepping up to the challenge that both Chiara and Shelley gave us in their videos at the beginning of this talk about, you know, what would it look like if we put women at the heart of the recovery? And, you know, our smaller kind of chunk is really, well, if we had inclusive and sustainable AI, what would that get us? What kind of daring future could we imagine? And so I wondered how you might think through that in your lens on digital culture.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to share the stage with so many incredible women. So thank you so much for including me. I often take a cultural lens, a digital lens, because sometimes when we talk about AI and inclusive AI, we tend to focus on things like the tools themselves or the teams that are making them. And I just think it's as Reem said earlier, everything that's happening algorithmically is actually a reflection, a direct mirror reflection of what our society values in general. And so if we were to put women at the center of this AI revolution, I think we would start to see things like wage gaps and wage inequality completely disappear. We would start to see the prioritization of sexual assault and violence against women becoming real data-driven, evidence-driven pursuits for governments and associations. We would start to see accessibility options, flexible work options that, by the way, are already driven and proven by data, championed by leaders, not just female CEOs, but championed by CEOs and leaders from all genders across the world. And so for me, I think about sometimes we forget that we have a lot of these tools available today. A couple of years ago, Salesforce used an AI, an algorithm, to go through their entire workforce of tens of thousands of employees to identify any instances where there were salary disparities and then fix those disparities. So my first question whenever somebody asks me what we should do tomorrow is I say, well, hold on, what are you doing today? Mm-hmm. What are you doing today to push all of these boundaries forward? Because if we're not doing it today, then how can we expect that to somehow magically appear in the future tomorrow?
I like that. That switch of the lens as well, because it helps us think about AI as an opportunity, not necessarily as the forcing function or the only technological way to get there. That we can use this conversation that we're having about AI as a way to rethink the role of people in economy, the role of people in society.
Yeah, and I mean, again, it's not just limited to the technology. If you want more women in your organization, what are you doing outside of the technological sphere in order to improve their integration into the workforce, in order to give them more opportunities, more chances, more flexibility, more control? And that's not your IT department, that's your HR department, that's your C-suite, that's your board of directors. Those are the people that need to be having these conversations. It's not just, oh, let's make sure that we have a team that's balanced with the technical specifications that also includes women. It's like, no, let's actually just have organizations where these priorities are championed inside the technological sphere and outside as well.
One of the things I find really interesting about your work, Rahaf, is that you really push a whole host of the client organizations you work with to put culture in the center of how they think about their strategy. What does it look like to put culture in the center of AI?
I think to flip it around, I would say, okay, well, what are we going to prioritize? Is it actually using us? Are we actually using AI to connect in a meaningful way? Are we using AI to give people flexibility, to give the women who were so hurt by the pandemic who dropped out of the workforce, how are we using AI to help them reintegrate? How are we developing technology policies that says, hey, we might actually have the technology that enable you to do your job and not have to sacrifice your family or not have to sacrifice your job for your family? These are all things that we can do right now instead of just saying, oh, well, this technology is really cool because it's going to help make us a whole bunch of money. It's like, well, let's actually start looking at how the technology can be used to improve the quality of life for the women and families of the people that need these types of economic opportunities.
And if you were to be giving advice to the companies that are listening in today, like what concretely could they be thinking about doing from their perspective to get to that place?
Sure. Off the top of my head, number one, are you asking the women in your organizations what they need? Are you actually asking them how you could make their lives easier, how technology can help support them, how technology can be used to give more empathy, more transparency, more celebration of the work that they're doing? Number two, are you using the technological tools and AI right now in order to remove barriers like hiring discrimination practices, like salary discrepancies, like wage inequality? Those are things that you could be doing right now. If you're not doing them, why? And then finally, on inclusivity, and this is something that I'm sure we'll talk about a lot, what are you doing to make sure that there's representation in your boardrooms all the way up across all verticals of the business to ensure that the right perspectives and that an equal perspectives are being shared?
That's fantastic. And what would you say in terms of making sure that more people in more AI product and service teams, that we can bring in a perspective that thinks outside the purely technological? How do we bring this socio-technical lens that you're recommending into more kinds of product and service teams?
Well, when we talk about AI and representative perspectives in AI, people are still thinking within the technological specifications, which I think is a big blind spot. To your point, we need to have psychologists and anthropologists and designers and artists and creatives involved in these conversations. How can you embed empathetic and compassionate technology if the only people that are working on it are only prioritizing technological specifications? I would actually look at teams and I would say having a holistic perspective is the only way to move tech forward. You can't just have the people who are building the technology that are making these decisions. You need the people who are going to be using the technology, the people who are going to be impacted by the technology, and just general representation of society in order to make sure that the tools that we're using are building towards a future that we all want to live in.
Rahaf, this is such a great way to tie together how we started the panel with Gabrielle's fantastic kind of call to action for women to define these kinds of problems, to not simply have the problems defined for women around the world, and particularly for women in the global South, but that we need to figure out better ways to have more people asking the questions, really. So I see our wonderful Women's Forum team have brought us all together in panel format. Welcome back, all. Several great questions have come through since we've been talking, and one that I heard across in various kind of formats is how do we get more people to help define the problem? So how do we get, concretely, what are some of the ways? AI seems like a big, scary topic. There are maybe people on this call who are not sure, who think of, crazy robots when we think of AI. How do we get more perspectives at the table to help define the problems that we use the technology to suggest solutions for?
Could I chip in?
Absolutely, Gabriela.
I was listening to the fascinating comments of all the panelists, and everything brings us to the fact that we need to fix the world first if we want to fix the AI world. And therefore, the question here is that maybe we can learn from some good practices of companies and sectors that have made progress in terms of having more women at the table. I would say that it was the financial crisis produced what we saw because there was groupthink and there was no diversity and there were no women because the financial markets were really man-led. And what you've seen with big investors like BlackRock is that they said, "Well, I'm not going to invest in firms that do not have a certain percentage of women at the top." Pretty straightforward. When you go down to the recruitment processes in all the industries, but I would say that this is not happening in Silicon Valley or in the leading enterprises on AI. You really need to make sure that you have 50-50 in all recruitment processes. I did that when I was at the OECD, and it created a lot of lack of comfort because, of course, I was the chief of staff. So it was easy for me to tell the director, yes, you're recruiting this, but you're putting 7 men and 3 women. What's the outcome? And then, of course, you start building the pipeline. So there are lots of interventions in the analog world that we have moved for gender equality that need to be introduced in the AI. But the mindsets, I think this is something that we should change. And one of the most important interventions is for women to believe, and I love the name of this.
And Gina, if I may just rebound on what Gabriela has said and perhaps offer a slightly provocative thought. Personally, I find it very positive that AI is putting to some extent under the spotlight problems that are not at all specific to AI. But as a matter of fact, it seems to be more shocking to say that a machine is biased than to say that the society is biased. So the fact that AI models pick up the societal bias and forces us to question them seriously is already a great contribution to inclusiveness, in my view. Now, do we need to go a step further and perhaps even teach AI to filter out those aspects and to nudge, as we discussed, in opposite direction? That's an interesting question. And to some extent, it shows how much AI's opportunities are and the risks are inextricably connected, and the fine and tiny ethical line between the two that we need to find.
That's great. Bonnie, I wonder if you might have a perspective on this, particularly because you're doing a lot of work in various really different kinds of communities that we don't think of as the clients for AI products and services.
Yeah, absolutely, Gina. And I think it's really a twofold issue. So I think on the one end, I think it's really important, like Gabriela had mentioned at the beginning, to make sure that we actually are empowering women with the technical skills so they are not just going to be users, they're not just going to be folks who are consulted, but they actually are actively capable of building. And so I think that one piece around making sure that the technology education and the skills transfer and the knowledge transfer is going to be at the crux of making sure that you're really, truly bringing in these perspectives in the fold, I think is really important. So I think that as a basis for sure is making sure that we really are thinking about girls' education, about women's education with a lens on technology and AI. Then I think on the other point is just, as you're working on some of these issues and you're working with collaborators and wanting to make sure that you're actually bringing in the right folks in your design processes, I think this is where it's really important to work with the local communities. I think you don't want to go in and feel that you know what the right answer is, or who you could identify who the right people are. I think in many of the projects that we work with, we recognize that a project will be implemented in a certain region, and we ask across all of those various local organizations, who are the folks who have the strongest connections to various community members, who has the deepest understanding of the ecosystems here. And I think that's, again, coming from a place of complete humility and learning from those who know more.
That's a great kind of perspective, right? Taking this humility, and rather than have a notion that we can apply AI and get the right solution, that this is really working in a co-design, participatory, and really inclusive and expansive model for thinking about how we design a better future. This brings me, I think everybody on this call, hopefully by now, is convinced of this. And if we've been encouraged in this Daring Circle to dare big, to really push what we might get out of a future of inclusive and sustainable AI, how do we convince organizations to join us. So tomorrow, we all go back into our organizations. What are the arguments we make? And what do we need to help make those arguments for this? Is it a stakeholder pressure? Is it internal pressure? Is it demonstrating a return on investment? Is it pointing to the ESG goals? How do we make this case?
Well, again, I feel that is the evidence. Bring the evidence. Bring the evidence. We are in a mess. We are in a mess because the COVID crisis found us completely unprepared, with lots of vulnerabilities in the health systems, in the economic systems, in the all this confinement is because we didn't have all the beds in the health sector. All this violence is because women are caught at home and they are not independent to just run away. I mean, we need to change course. I think that the pandemic is just providing us with the huge opportunity to say, well, it's not the right model that we need to produce. I think that we need, when we say in United Nations systems that we need to build back better, is really to rethink how do we go out from this crisis in a way that is more sustainable. And the evidence tells us that when you have diversity, when you have different disciplines, as Rohan was saying, when you have different mindsets, when you have co-creation in terms of the solutions, they are more sustainable. So we need to document that more. And this is something that UNESCO is going to be doing. We're going to be documenting how more sustainable and resilient the solutions for the economy, for the society, for the environment, as was mentioned too, are when you have diverse and more pluralistic teams and groups. And from my perspective, it's not about convincing people, it's about policies. It's about incentives. It's about economic incentives, and it's about creating the rules. And the rules, the regulatory frameworks are not yet there up to the standard of what we need.
As you said earlier, Gabriela, the baseline is not good, but we can get better. Rim or Rahaf, I wonder if you have a thought on how we make these arguments to bring to bring the organizations we work with along with us on this future.
I think it has to be really along the whole chain. So we need data points and evidence to convince stakeholders to really put pressure also to regulation. That's absolutely true. But I also believe that we need to work on the ground with women, with young women, because it starts there. It starts really by educating them, because if we miss this step, whatever we will do at the top of or at the end of the chain will break at one moment, because we don't have this traction since inception, since the start, which really is when those girls are picking up their education roadmap. And this is also a key milestone, I think, in the whole process.
I think for me, it's about asking questions. I think there isn't a single organization out there right now that doesn't have some lofty vision statement goal about making the world a better place or something. And I think it would just be going into meetings and taking in those documents with us and saying, hey, it says here that you want a more inclusive and sustainable future. Cool. What are you actually doing about it? What are we doing about it now? Are we doing enough? Because it's, for me, I've always said this, you got to put your money where your mouth is, and you've got to follow your money, right? You got to follow the money trail, follow the investment trail. I don't care about the PR campaign, and I don't care about the slogan that sounds really cool when you put it on social media for like the 36 hours of our attention span. I care about what are you actually investing in, and how are you supporting women? So that's all I would say. It's not like I'm saying we should do more. I'm just saying this is what we're saying we're doing. Are we actually doing it in practice? And if no, why not? And I would always be very inclusive. And if no, what can we do to get started? What would a good first step be? Who should we bring in to make this happen? How can we improve our results? How can we increase our impact? And just keep having those conversations, because I think inviting people to participate is always going to work a bit better than like lecturing people with facts and statistics. I think we've learned over this pandemic that people's aptitudes for facts is a bit stretched at the moment. So perhaps we can just go back and say, hey, there's an issue, but we can get this done if we all contribute and if we all start making, action items towards it.
We have a comment that's come in from our wonderful audience that, this is the first time in our history where we have a chance to work together to right the wrongs and not brush them under the carpet. And that we can really use this moment of where we've really had a difficult time. We've really had a difficult time of through the COVID pandemic. It's been incredibly difficult for women around the world. It's been incredibly difficult for families. Everyone is grieving. Everyone has had such a hard time. And so that we need to kind of think about how do we come together? And this started out as a panel about how do we take inclusive AI and build a better future. But I think what I'm hearing from a lot of you is that there's a great opportunity at the moment for leaders like the leaders on this call to really use and seize the moment to say, here's how we raise the baseline. Here's how we make a better world. Here's the kind of world that we want. Another comment has just come in that says, we absolutely agree with Rim that AI is holding humanity a mirror and pointing out where we should act. And as long as we're brave and looking in that mirror, we can stop running away. And so I just, in the minute we have left, I want to thank all of you for joining us and and give you a chance to just reflect on where we are and where we might go.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you, everyone, for this great conversation. You should see, and I tried to pass on to you some of the conversation that was happening in the public space. It was lively, and I hope many of those who've contributed will stay in a networking room afterwards. But let me just pick up some of the insights from this great conversation. We challenge ourselves to think about the potential of AI to enable inclusion now and in the future. And as Gabriela said, we really need to co-create AI with women rather than for women, and empower women to define and address problems using technology rather than the other way around. Bonnie's example really gave us a glimpse of the power of AI to address humanity's greatest challenge, from climate change to modern slavery. You also reminded us, Bonnie, to put human in the loop, always working with women and the local communities to bring their perspective to technology. Reem and Rahaf said, let's make sure that our focus on designing inclusive AI does not distract us from the reality that our society remains deeply unequal in the analog world. And as we shape the digital world, we need a firm foundation of inclusion and equality. So that's a very pale summary of what was discussed, but I really invite you to join us in the networking room. We had some of those discussions continuing yesterday on the STEM Daring Circle, and it was just amazing. So I just want to thank you all for your amazing contribution. This is a conversation to be continued, and I will make sure that we stay in touch with you, obviously, with the progress of this Daring Circle that is going to continue for the rest of the year. So for those of you who are able to join us, please click on the interactivity tab at the top of the chat. For our speakers and moderators, if you can stay a little bit with us, you should see in the chat box the ability to join. You can leave quietly, as they say in Clubhouse, at any point, but please join us if you can. Let me thank you again, the speakers, Gina, for your masterful moderation, audience for your amazing participation, and I'll see you very soon, I hope, in the networking room. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.